Henry VIII is remembered in history as one of the most barbaric and brutal kings ever to reign over England. However, someone tried to steal the bones of the king when he died. The Tudor King is buried inside of a small vault today under the floor of St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, close to many other former kings and queens. However, Henry VIII dreamed of being buried inside of a huge tomb in Westminster Abbey, but 500 years on he is still laid to rest in a rather discreet and quiet place. But Henry died on the 28th of January 1547, and his son Edward VI then succeeded him as a king. However, Henry left many instructions for his funeral and burial, and he wished to be buried alongside his third wife Jane Seymour, and that a regency council should be set up to help the young boy king rule. But Henry was buried with Jane, but in the centuries after it was found that her coffin remained in a very good condition. However, Henry's was not, and because of this an opportunistic foot soldier reached into Henry VIII's coffin and took one of his bones. Join us today as we look at the theft of Henry VIII's corpse, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Following Henry VIII's death, the king's body was embalmed by the royal doctors. They then took out the king's vital organs. This was traditional and normal for kings and queens, and they would then do this to inter them away from the body. Henry's body was then packed out with spices to keep away decay and to preserve his remains, but it was then wrapped in a cerecloth, a thick and heavy wax cloth, which covered the body of wealthy people. Cerecloths acted almost like mummification, and today some royals who were buried centuries ago, it's believed, are still preserved remarkably because of the cloth. But following this, Henry was then left to lay in state, whilst the chaos emerged in government about Edward VI taking over and the establishment of the Regency Council. But then his funeral took place, and it was so large, the procession was, that some of the streets of Windsor and London had to be widened to allow his coffin to pass by without issue. It was a colossal 4 miles long from start to finish, and the funeral cortege was covered in black cloth, and on top of Henry's coffin was much of his royal regalia, including his orb and sceptre. Also on top of the coffin was a large life-sized effigy of Henry VIII, which was dressed in the king's clothes, which had been encrusted with jewels and riches. The people who saw the procession from Whitehall to Windsor were amazed at the pageantry, and for many this effigy was the first time they had ever seen an image of the man who had ruled over them for a long time. The procession continued towards Windsor, and the coffin was pulled by 4 large horses, and it arrived at Sion Abbey for the night and rested to allow the horses to have a break, and also for the officials to rest too. But Sion Abbey, it's believed, was the place where Henry VIII's body may have exploded due to the movement of the king's coffin during the funeral procession. Gases built up after the death, and these were released, and it was said that the king's body exploded when it was resting at the abbey overnight, and then dogs may have even feasted on this. But the damage had been done to Henry VIII's coffin, and the following day the procession continued towards Windsor. It entered St George's Chapel, and it took 16 strong yeomen of the guard to carry Henry VIII into the chapel. Then the funeral service took place. Henry VIII's coffin was then lowered into the vault he had built for Jane Seymour underneath the choir part of the chapel, where the Order of the Garter meets. But this burial vault was disturbed a number of times over the years, including when a certain disgraced and executed Stuart king was interred in the same vault. Following the execution of King Charles I in the English Civil War, Charles was interred in the very same vault, secretly, to not attract possible royalists to venerate him and even dig him up. But Henry VIII would have been furious at this, as he viewed the Stuarts as some of his most disgraceful enemies. He was a king who had rampaged his soldiers throughout Scotland, the land of the Stuarts, many times, but here he was buried next to the most infamous Stuart monarch of them all. Henry even banned the Stuarts from taking the throne, but when Elizabeth I died, the daughter of Henry VIII, she had no other choice but to invite the Stuarts onto the throne of England. However, when this interment was done of Charles I, it was noted that the coffin of Henry VIII was already in a bad way, that the exterior wooden shell had broken and shattered in places. The inner lead-lined coffin was also said to have been looked as if it had been battered by violence, meaning it was rather severely dented. However, this could have been done by the explosion involving Henry's body, or by someone else having broken into the vault. But when the burial vault was surveyed, it was noted that Henry VIII's skeleton and skull could be seen through holes in the coffin, and it was also noted that his skull even had traces of his beard still on, but these had been exposed to the air in the vault for some time, meaning decay had set in. But the coffin of Jane Seymour, which was very smaller and daintier when compared with the huge wooden coffin of Henry VIII, was said to have been in perfect condition, almost as if it had been buried yesterday. But there were no records of Henry VIII's coffin being repaired at any point, and because of this it's possible that inside the burial vault today, the Henry's remains are still exposed 500 years after his death. It would have been somewhere in the history books if the king had been placed in a new coffin, but it's also likely that the king and queen of the time would have had to hand over their own money from the treasury to do this. We know Queen Victoria during her reign spent a large amount of money repairing places of royal burials and building her own mausoleum, but Henry VIII's burial site was not a priority. But there was one record of a foot soldier who tried to steal the bones of King Henry VIII, and he planned to have these remains fashioned into something in particular. It was stated that the sexton did his best to clear the chapel. Nevertheless, Isaac the sextonsman said that a foot soldier had hid himself so as he was not discerned, and being greedy of prey, crept into the vault and cut so much of the velvet pall that covered the great body, as he judged would hardly be missed, and wimpled also a hole through the said coffin that was the largest, probably fancying himself that was something well worth his adventure. The section at his opening the door espied the sacrilegious person, who being searched, a bone was found about him, with which he was said he would have the knife. The governor being therefore informed of, he gave him his reward, and the lords and others present were convinced that the real body was in the great coffin, with some before having scrupled. What this means is that the coffin of King Henry VIII, which was referred to as a great coffin, had holes on it, and that the foot soldier in question broke into the burial vault of the former Tudor king, then made his own hole in the ruined, decaying coffin. But then he reached into it and stole one of the bones of the notorious Tudor monarch. But this man then wanted to craft a knife handle with this, but the theft was quickly discovered, and the bone was then put back inside of the coffin. However, the hole was not repaired. The coffin and vault of Henry VIII were opened a number of times following this, but the last time was in the 19th century. The vault of Henry was explored by Sir Henry Halford, and he looked at the body of King Henry VIII through the holes in the coffin, but he was more concerned with the coffin next to the large one, as he was more bothered about Charles I's remains and locating them as they'd been lost to time. He opened Charles's coffin, and he found the headless corpse of Charles I, as his head had fallen off after it had been sewn back on, and this was the last time that the burial vault was allegedly opened. Each day thousands of tourists visit Windsor Castle, and they walk over the very burial vault that the most notorious kings of England were buried inside of. But they may also not know that beneath their feet may be exposed and decaying remains of Henry VIII, but there was a significant amount of damage done to his coffin over time, and it was not helped by the man who wanted to steal one of the most infamous kings' bones. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.